Welcome to the first episode of my Experiencing Wisdom podcast series, where we explore different topics related to attaining wisdom through experience and mindful living. And I thought, who better than Sid, the brains and energy behind This Is Love Amplified, to come on as my first guest on the topic of reparenting. Reparenting, why did I pick that topic? I think for me, reparenting was really important when it came to breaking out of my conditioning and learning to live life authentically, or at least embark on that path of authentic living. And it has allowed me to really feel at ease with myself and grow as a human being. So, Sid, why were you interested in joining me with this topic on this episode?
I think it's just a phenomenal opportunity to be here with you. I think what you're trying to achieve with this podcast on experiencing wisdom and living mindfully just resonates with me a lot, and I just wanted to do my bit to support you in it. I think this topic of reparenting is really close to my heart because in relationships specifically, we are often repeating the patterns that we learned as children. And those patterns sometimes enable us, but more often than not withhold us from building healthy relationships in our lives. And through the work that I do, that's the awareness that I'm trying to create. I'm trying to create more awareness about how our childhood traumatic patterns influence us in the people that we attract, in the relationships that we choose, and how we cope with the ups and downs of those relationships, including heartbreaks. In order to be in a healthy relationship, it is really important to reparent yourself, to understand what are those patterns that are holding you back so that you can choose differently going forward. And hence, in order to build a healthy, secure life and, of course, a secure relationship, the importance of reparenting just resonated very closely to my heart, and I wanted to be here to talk about that if I can contribute to that in any way.
No, thank you so much for joining us, Sid. For those who don't know, Sid is a wonderful relationship coach, in my opinion. He's often coaching me as we go along, exploring our friendship, and I find his insights quite thoughtful. And I think they have helped me address some things, just like those little nooks and crannies that I may be hesitating a little bit to accept. So thank you for coming on. And, I think we both are in agreement with the fact that I think parenting really shapes who we end up becoming as adults. And when we are adults, we have a choice. Either we live in the conditioned way that we were told to live, or we reparent ourselves in order to live life authentically and understand the seed of our true power and make decisions from a place of truth and joy. And, for those who don't know my background, I spent 7 years working as a crisis interventionist in university campuses. And over there, I often experienced young adults, who were exploring themes of freedom and individuality for the first time and moving out of home. They would explore romantic relationships. And as a crisis interventionist, I was often called in when things went to quite a bit of an extreme sometimes. And I noticed it was a lot because they were kind of trapped in their own trauma and repeating those cycles of trauma within their relationships. And in my experience as someone who has been through that herself, like, in my own relationship, I found that reparenting was really the key to try and learn how to come out of it and create a new path for myself. So, Sid, could you talk to me a bit about why you decided to start This Is Love Amplified?
Absolutely. So, a couple of years ago, beginning of 2023, I went through a really difficult breakup. And the challenge with this breakup was not that it was tough in itself. The bigger challenge was that this was a repeating cycle. I had found myself dating the exact same person, just in a different body, where every relationship would start with this burst of energy, this infatuation, and from my perspective at least, wanting to be all in as quickly as possible. And very quickly it would burn out with conflicts and avoidance and me chasing and trying to force them to be in a relationship with me in whatever ways I knew how. And when this relationship ended, for the first time, I took a step back and I was like, wait, in all my relationships, I have kept blaming them that I'm willing to give you the love. Why are you not receiving it? This was the first time I took a step back and said, I'm the only common element in all of these relationships. Am I doing something wrong? And that is a Pandora's box that I opened with that question, because that made me want to reflect on my actions, my choices. I got involved with therapy. I started reading books. I started listening to podcasts. And I was just being bombarded with all possible kinds of information that are out there. I think over the course of the next 6, 7, 8 months, I must have read 60 plus books on this topic. And I realized that therapy, for example, was really helpful. The information that I was getting really helpful. But in that emotionally vulnerable state, in a distraught state of mind, I didn't really have the ability to understand what of this information was relevant to me. And more importantly, hold myself accountable to actually implement that information into my daily life. And that's when coaching came into play. That's when I finally understood that I needed a more actionable, guided approach of what I need to do to get rid of the patterns that I was repeating, get rid of the triggers and traumas that I had been carrying with me for God knows how many years, maybe even decades of my life, and learn how to build healthy relationships. When I thought I figured this out, I realized that this information needs to be more accessible to everybody else out there as well. Because it's not that information is not there. Information is not often streamlined and given to people in the bits and pieces that they need so that they could heal much more smoothly, much more effectively. And that's what I'm trying to do right now. I'm trying to give this information to people in a more accessible, meaningful, tangible way so that they can break away from their heartbreaks, from their toxic patterns, and actually be in the healthy relationship that they truly deserve.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for, doing that kind of work, because I know sometimes when I'm scrolling my Instagram feed and one of your posts comes along, it feels like it was written for me, because it's so like, and to think that you have such a big audience and you're making a post that a lot of people can relate with, and to think that that experience is so specific is exactly what I had, means like somewhere we are all connected in like our collective conscious and unconscious state, and the experiences are repeating because as a collective consciousness we have some healing left to do. We have to break out of that conditioning, and I love that you're adding in such a pool of positivity into that collective consciousness and really trying to initiate change.
I'm just trying to do my bit.
Yeah, no,
And
for
I
sure.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that. I think when you were talking, for me, something that stood out is the fact that you spoke a little bit about accountability. You said, in all of these patterns that you were experiencing, you would always blame the other person, and then eventually it got to a point where you had to take some accountability. That's something that I notice is a common theme even in friendships. A lot of people will always be like, well, I'm saying this or I'm reacting this way because of what you did, but they never really take accountability for the part that they had to play, and the role that they had to kind of you know have in that. And I think accountability is like the key starting point of kind of initiating any kind of healing journey and any kind of mindful living, because even to enter something like you said, like talk therapy, right? Experiencing talk therapy, even that takes point of accountability to get to. I remember, when I started embarking on that mindful living journey. I was in university. We were doing a course in it was named the psychology of meditation, and part of that course was not just exploring a lot of research on it, the impacts of meditation on the brain, but also meditating ourselves in part of the class. And that's kind of what got me started on this journey of really holding myself accountable. And I found that as I was doing that course, that's also when I entered my first ever relationship. And I noticed that what was going on was that I was very mindfully aware of the issues that were occurring. And I just didn't know what really to do about it or how to go about addressing it, because I think at that point I was experiencing feeling aware for the first time and living consciously. So I wasn't at that point of, attaining a lot of wisdom to try and understand what to do. Could you talk to me a bit about why therapy is different from coaching and why you do coaching?
So, to your point about accountability and not knowing what to do, even if you are aware that something needs to be done, I think from my vantage point, that's really where therapy and coaching are different from each other. When I talk about therapy, I want to make sure that we're on the same page because I'm talking about talk therapy
Yeah.
only. There are so many other techniques and tools that therapy now uses as well. And I don't have explicit experience with those, so I cannot comment on those. But to me, my experience with talk therapy has been about sharing how I'm feeling. And it's been a great safe space to dump the burden of emotions that I may be carrying at that point in time. But when this breakup happened to me, that's not the space that I needed. I am very lucky to be blessed with the best friends on this planet. So I had great people who I could trauma dump on.
Okay.
And what I needed was somebody to tell me, Sid, this is how you break away from these patterns. This is what you now need to do to show up in your life, show up in your relationships, show up in your friendships differently. And I think that expectation is a very unfair expectation to have from your friends. For them to have that level of knowledge, depth to tell you this is what you need to do, that's where the expectations would become unfair if I wanted my friends to give me that level of guidance and approach, right? And so, because I needed more actionable steps, that's where coaching came into play. If you think about it, the easiest way for me to describe it is think about fitness coaching.
Yeah.
You go to your fitness coach and you say, hey, I want to lose, let's say, 6 pounds in 6 months. And so your coach gives you a diet chart, a fitness plan, a workout routine essentially, a hydration plan, a sleep routine, and a combination of all of these things that help you get to your goal. That's how I think coaching is. If you then struggle with the sleep or the food or the water intake or the workout routine itself, then your coach comes back into play and tells you, okay, this is what you now need to do differently, or this is why this is not working for you, let's try something different. That to me is coaching, where there is a lot more accountability, there's a lot more intentionality, but there is a process which is focused on getting you to a goal of, from my vantage point, moving on from heartbreak, breaking those toxic patterns, and ultimately being in the healthy relationship. And so it's not just a space for us to dump your emotions. Right? Not that that space is not an important space to have, but we're more focused on being intentional and action oriented towards getting to a specific goal that we want for ourselves.
No, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think I've experienced different kinds of therapy. There's three kinds that I've actually gone through. One was the traditional talk therapy, and I think after some months of initially doing it after my breakup, I was like, no, this isn't really working because it's not helping me change the pattern. It was allowing me to feel more compassion for myself. It was allowing me to be more accountable to myself and to as another person as a result of that. But it wasn't really addressing the core issues I was having. And then we moved slowly into Hakomi mindfulness therapy, where we use a lot of body sensing in conjunction with therapy. So that was a good step up. And eventually we moved into EMDR because we realized, I say we because I suppose I always see the relationship I had with my therapist as a partnership.
Absolutely.
We moved into EMDR because I had a lot of PTSD from my childhood, really.
Sure.
And doing that really changed a lot of things.
Yes.
Because EMDR is not typical therapy.
No.
And it's also different from coaching.
Yes.
It's different. And then eventually we got to a point where we did move into coaching with my therapist.
Right.
Because I had healed enough where those patterns were not reoccurring again, but
Sure.
I was requiring some kind of guidance a little bit to start these new ways of living, these
Sure.
new patterns.
Sure.
And I think coaching is really what helped at that point. Now that I think about it, it makes me feel like it requires quite a bit of humility as well to, surrender and be like, yeah, go to this person and be like, yeah, I need help. Definitely does. I think we spoke a little bit about the role childhood has to play in, the patterning we have. My parents were instrumental naturally in kind of me developing the kind of conditioning that I had, and it caused a lot of patterns in my life to evolve that I wasn't really happy with, because I often found my parents to be operating in extremes of either complete abandonment of certain things and kind of letting me lead and take charge, or either the extreme of wanting to control every minute detail of certain aspects of my life. What do you feel like, or what have you noticed or observed rather, when you are coaching people? What do you feel like are generally the correlation between the kind of parenting they had in contrast with the romantic experiences that they're struggling with or having?
It's a great question, Zartaj, and I think this needs to be answered at a fair amount of depth. So there's a few elements that you mentioned over here. Hopefully I'm able to clarify all of those elements. The first element is to recognize the needs of a child. When we are children, we need food, shelter, and love in order to feel truly nourished and fulfilled. And there is a huge amount of dependency on parents or caregivers or aunts, uncles, neighbors around us to be able to give us those things. A lot of us grew in a generation where our parents were a lot more focused on food and shelter, because there was little to no awareness about the importance of love and emotions in the process of child development. And so they thought that they were doing the best that they could, which was focusing on what they thought was the most essential: food and shelter, maybe education and things like that, in order to give a child a healthy upbringing. And in that process, knowingly or unknowingly, they compromised on the emotional safety for the child. Now, as we are not taught about love, if you think about your own childhood, my childhood certainly, we were taught math and English and everything else that we may have studied, but more often than not, we don't get taught what a healthy relationship is, what healthy love should look like, should feel like. And so what we do is we create our own definition of love based on what we see between our parents, what we see between our aunts, uncles, neighbors, our community, and also how we feel loved by them. And now in our adult lives, we are seeking partners who align with that definition of love, even if it is not healthy. In the process of wanting love from our parents, we may have adopted a lot of coping mechanisms. And these coping mechanisms were just the way we learned how to seek love in the environment that we grew up in. So, for example, if we grew up in an environment where love was conditional, where love was achievement oriented, so you had to do something or show up as something in order to get love, then we learned that that's what love needs to be. And we became a lot more clingy, trying to prove our worth, trying to seek validation from other people, because for us, love meant outsourcing our worth onto the people who we want love from. And now in our adult lives, we get attracted to people who reinforce this pattern, who push and pull so that we know that these are the people who we want to outsource our worth to in order to be loved. The exact other end of the spectrum, maybe when we were growing up, we learned that maybe we are too much. And in order to be loved by our parents, our caregivers, the people who are important to us, we need to hide ourselves. We need to be smaller. We need to be lesser. We can't be as expressive. We can't be as emotional. And so now in our adult lives, we seek relationships where the partner is not exposing us or asking us to be too vulnerable or asking us to go to a deeper, to just a depth where the relationship can be built at a more sustainable level. And so as long as we are not being challenged, as long as our walls are not being knocked on, we feel comfortable being in a relationship. But the moment it touches a certain level of depth, we run away from it. And so that's how our childhood patterns influence the relationships that we build in our adult lives. And of course, this is the anxious attachment style or the avoidant attachment style. And these buzzwords kind of come into play to influence the way we seek love now. But until we are aware of these coping mechanisms that we built, unless we're aware of how we learned to seek love, we cannot unlearn that and then learn healthy ways of seeking love and being in love and being in relationships.
No, for sure, definitely. I think like when I embarked on this journey of mindfulness and trying to live mindfully and practice these principles in my life, that's when it really came to my awareness. What part of me was mostly anxious, and some were avoidant, but I think predominantly anxious. I think naturally, I like now, even after becoming aware of it, it's now that 10 years later of going through this process that I'm understanding the true depth of impact it has had. Whether it was my hyper monitoring of everyone in the room and being hyper tuned to everyone else's emotions, which in part made me a great crisis interventionist, but also kind of, created feelings of, feeling naked for my friends. Because sometimes I was so attuned, I'm seeing everything, and sometimes they didn't want to be seen as someone who needed help by me, their friend. So it was hard to navigate those boundaries as well as I was going through, this process of discovering, doing my job, and also trying to figure out how to leave my job where it was, not have it seep into my life, but also retaining those skills, to support my friends and, my family members and all of that. So it was, all of that can sometimes be a lot to work through as well. And I think starting with meditation and even a yoga practice every day really was very therapeutic, and learning to unpack that systematically. I think, a huge like change that I've noticed in my life over time, over this like 10-year period that I'm referring to, is that there has been a significant change in my inner voice. And that has been kind of instrumental in not only reparenting myself, but also developing healthy dynamics with other individuals. How would you say your inner voice has changed over time?
That's a really important question, Zartash, because the way we talk to ourselves, about ourselves, is really the primary determinant of the kind of relationships we build as well. If you think about, let's say, your best friend, when they do a mistake, when they upset you in some way or the other, which I assume they inevitably do, right? The way you talk about them is, oh, they must have been tired, or they must have not thought through the consequences of their actions. I'm upset, but I will communicate to them that I'm upset. We will resolve this, but we want to move past this because I know that deep down, he or she cares about me. Deep down, I care about them. The same mistake, when it's done by somebody else, somebody who you may not like as much, you interpret the situation completely differently. You say, oh my God, why are they always after my life? Why are they always upsetting me? And it's not that the mistake was any different, but the reaction comes from what you believe about them. And the work on beliefs is really the crux of what I do when I'm working with the people I work with, because oftentimes you are your own best friend and you are the person who you dislike the most. Think about the last time you made a mistake. When you recognize that it was a mistake, how did you talk to yourself? Did you say, you know what, I tried my best. I did whatever I could with the knowledge, information, ability I had at that point in time. And I'm going to give myself grace. I'm going to give myself compassion. I'm going to learn how to do better, but I'm also going to move on. Or you say, oh my God, I'm so clumsy. Why do I get into the same stuff all the time? Why do I choose the same people all the time? And the way you talk about yourself, talk to yourself, really reflects on how you treat yourself. Over the course of my journey, I have moved from the latter to the former, where I used to be very critical of myself. I used to pressurize myself to be a perfectionist and judge myself if I fell short in any capacity. I used to be overly critical of the decisions I made as well, just because I was fueled with self doubt. And now, when I look back at myself, I keep reminding myself that I am human too. And I'm allowed to make mistakes. And I'm doing the best I can with the ability, awareness, knowledge, information I have at that point in time. And if I'm doing the best I can, I can't be mad at myself. Yes, that doesn't mean that I don't have an opportunity to learn. Doesn't mean that I don't have the opportunity to do better, which is why I will learn and do better. But I'm not going to treat myself with lack of kindness because I was not perfect.
Thank you for sharing that, because that sounds exactly like the 2 years after my breakup. I think the first year I was so hyper fixated on what I could have done differently to have made it work. I was so critical of myself, and, unfairly so. And then in the second year, somewhere, I started to experience or notice there was a lot of anger bubbling up. Anger at how I'd been mistreated, or rather, more anger at myself for how I had allowed myself to be treated and for not have walked away sooner. And, at the time, I distinctly remember telling myself something was mentally wrong with me for having accepted that. But, now that I look back at that time, I have so much grace for that girl, because she was just learning to discover and process and understand what has actually unfolded. And, the conditioning of, um, you know, uh, being perfect and wanting to be perfect, and that's where my self worth was being held. That played a huge role in that first year after the breakup, of that constant criticism, right? And we're really human. Like, the second year, I was flooding with anger because I finally realized he made a lot of mistakes too. And, that over time started to change my self image. I noticed, like, there's a common theme these days that I've been noticing a lot, especially with the boom of social media, that people are willing to go to incredible lengths to preserve their self image. They often will, like, deny reality for the way it is, choose to live in their delusions, and also insist you partake in that, so that they can preserve their self image. And I feel like being so deep in that kind of state of mind never really initiates a drive for change, like a desire to want to change, because then again it comes back to the accountability and you're denying that accountability entirely. I wanted to ask you kind of like, at what point did you realize you needed to change the way you were living? And what really drove you towards that change?
You raised some really important points over here. I think a very important point is about change. And change is not something that our human brain is comfortable with in the first place. Our human brain is not designed for success, for health, for prosperity. It is designed for safety, for protection. And so, any kind of change, even if it is a change you've been wanting all your life, the human brain takes time to adapt to it, to adapt to the consequences of that change in its entirety. And so, change can be very difficult for anybody, even if, as I mentioned, you wanted that change. The second thing that you mentioned is the concept of self identity. We have, in the work that I do with the people I work with, we have an entire conversation dedicated to ego and how the ego steps in to protect the identity that the ego so desperately holds close. And this identity is just, again, it's just trying to protect you. It's not trying to hurt you, but it's protecting you in the only way it knows how. And the way it knows how may not be healthy, which kind of comes back to our topic of reparenting, where you step in and you learn about your ego responses and you teach your ego what is healthy, what isn't, when you need it to protect you, and when you don't need it to step in and create a story out of nothing. And to be honest, all of these challenges were challenges I dealt with in my relationships, but also with my friendships and in other aspects of my life, even though just because I was never as vulnerable in my friendships as I was in my relationship, I never really realized that these things play up a very strong role in other aspects of my life outside my relationship as well. But when I healed from my relationship traumas, it kind of fixed the entire boat. Anyway, coming back to your question about when I realized or why I realized that I wanted to go through this, was just being exhausted. I was so tired after this breakup of dating the same person again and again and again. And I think it was a light bulb moment maybe where I realized I deserve better than this. And if it is in my hands, if it is because of me that I'm falling in the same patterns again and again, that means I can do something about it. And so I wanted to explore that to the extent possible. What is my contribution to these relationships? Where is it that I need to stop the self-blame and the self-criticism, take accountability for the limited knowledge that I may have had previously, for the coping mechanisms that I may have developed that don't serve me anymore, and rewire so that I can live differently and attract better and build more secure relationships going forward. And that exhaustion was really what made me want to do this. The exhaustion made me realize that I needed to make change happen. And even if this change is uncomfortable, I want this change to happen because I will be in a much better space in the longer run if I embrace this change today, instead of going ahead in my life and 5 years down the line looking back and saying, I had the opportunity, I had the breakthrough, I just didn't take any action. And I may have repeated 5 other relationships reflecting the exact same patterns.
Yeah. No, that's really fair. I think for me, what really drove me to change and understanding myself with compassion was learning to make my ego my friend and teaching it healthy boundaries, and actually not necessarily always viewing it as something negative. Understanding that it is a product of my conditioning and my fears and desires and all of that, but working with it in a way, and I think right now I'm like really like in the, peak point of establishing my boundaries, because initially when I was learning to establish boundaries with my ego and figure out a healthy way of living, it started off with um, you know cut people out of my life entirely, because at that point some situations were getting to a point where I was allowing so much to happen out of this need to get love back, uh, because of my ego, that it things would be at such an extreme point that there is no other solution other than cutting certain people out of my life. Then I got to the second stage where I started really aggressively um and very staunchly defending my boundaries, because my ego needed to be very clear, no, these are my boundaries, you're not to cross the line, and all of this stuff. And that also didn't help entirely, because it also created a lot of chaos for the people who had to experience my anger, and also myself. And sometimes that still occurs, because sometimes, let's say, I've meditated a lot and something deep has been uncovered and I'm very aggravated that day and my boundaries being violated, I might respond from a place of anger. But I think eventually over time, I'm getting to a point where I'm able to compassionately build them, identify the warning signs early on, and put the right contingencies in place. Because it doesn't have to be such an angry defense. It can be, you have this beautiful garden that you've cultivated of your life that has a lot of fruit, a lot of abundance to share, and now have learned to build a fence that isn't that high. It's like a normal fence, and then I've learned to build a gate that I can open and close, and I don't ever have to let anyone inside the gate, but the fence is low enough that I can share the fruits of my abundance should I wish to. And that's like, kind of the point that I'm trying to get a lot better at it, more consistent with it. I think that in itself has impacted my self identity a lot, and in terms of I'm finally becoming who I always thought in my head I was. Sid, how has the cultivation of healthy boundaries impacted the relationships you have and are building?
Boundaries is a really important concept in the world of relationships. And funnily enough, if you speak with anybody I've worked with in the past, they'll laugh at it when they hear what I'm going to say next, because I often describe the boundaries as in the form of a castle. If you think about a castle, it has boundaries on its sides, but those boundaries are not meant to push people away. The boundaries are meant to protect what is within. And in that process, you will unintentionally push some people away. But you have to realize that if you were doing it with the intention of protecting what is within, then the only people who are upset are people who don't have the same level of access, same level of control on you that they once had.
Yeah.
But to your point about figuring out these boundaries, it's not the easiest of processes, especially if you are not used to what boundaries are, if you're not accustomed to what boundaries are and how to maintain them. You could be swinging on either extremes. Firstly, you could find it difficult to build those boundaries, to communicate those boundaries, to actually respect those boundaries if they are being breached, because you don't know how to, and you're always afraid of upsetting someone, pushing someone away, even if that's not your intention. On the other extreme, as you mentioned, you start drawing walls instead of boundaries, because you don't know what the right boundaries should be. So in your anger, in your frustration, you build all these walls restricting access to everybody in a blanket way, or cutting off complete access to people just because they tried to come closer to you, right, even if they didn't actually come to the boundary line itself. And so that we have to recognize that that's a process of figuring it out, especially if you're not used to having boundaries. It is a process of figuring out what works for you and what keeps people at the distance you want to keep them, and give as much access as you want them to have without disrupting your peace within. In my own life, I think generally I'm very good at now maintaining my boundaries. Of course, I'm not perfect. Every now and then I forget how to communicate boundaries in a healthy way. Every now and then I allow people to breach those boundaries and access a space that's not meant for them. But I have to remind myself that it's a learning process and it's a growth process for me as well. But having these boundaries has instilled this innate sense of self worth where I know what I deserve. I know what I'm seeking in my life and I know how to protect myself. Because unless I protect myself, I don't teach others how to love me as well. Unless I set the right boundaries, I don't teach them how I want to be loved. And if I don't determine my boundaries for myself, I basically give them access to determine my boundaries for me. And it comes back to the original pattern about outsourcing our worth, outsourcing the level of access that people should have to me. And so now I'm at a lot more peace. I'm a lot more comfort with the life that I've built for myself and the access that different people have to me at different points in time.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I think I have also discovered through this process that sometimes my boundaries can change, and they I think there are some boundaries that once you've figured out how they are in their foundation, they may never change. And eventually you get to a point where I think you get so good at adapting and figuring out what is working and what's not, that you start building boundaries in a way that they'll start to remain, more established. And then there's newer and newer boundaries that you're trying to figure out. So I've definitely gone back and forth with myself on a lot of occasions for different things. And, as I've evolved as a person, sometimes I don't feel the need to have a certain boundary and whatnot. So I think what I've arrived at is the idea that change is constant and stagnancy is a choice. And that, principle is kind of at the core of how I've been lately defining my self identity. Right now, in my self identity, boundaries are playing a huge role as I'm in the process of discovering um, at more depth of what I need to cultivate and build so I can live in a healthy way and generate compassion in the world. And, all of that in combination, with mindful living and experiencing wisdom has allowed me to reparent myself. And I think it's going to be a lifelong journey in some ways. So thank you so much, for joining me
Absolutely.
and having this conversation. I really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we'll have some chats on a different day. I feel like there's so much more to explore because boundaries can be an episode on itself.
Absolutely.
The ego can be an episode in itself,
Absolutely.
and so many other things. But yeah, thank you, and all the best with your journey with This Is Love Amplified. I think you're doing some great work that can help a lot of people.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Cheers.